Well, we're moving into March
Already?
2023, which means it's going to be wildflower season. Bluebonnet are going to bloom.
Springtime?
Yes, and allergies.
Yes, exactly right.
Jeff and I both may get deeper voices over the next couple of weeks.
It's true.
With allergy
It's
season.
true.
But moving to March means we're moving on to another letter.
Yes, a big one this time.
In what we're calling Jeff's chronology. That means if you disagree with the order of the letters, you can email Jeff. Watch for his email address to appear on the screen. Not really.
No.
I wouldn't do that to you.
No.
Well, actually, I would. But,
I was going to say.
But we're moving on to Corinth, and the first of two letters.
Yes.
At least let's put that correctly.
Two letters that we have.
Two preserved letters. Yes.
Two letters that we have.
And I think that.
I didn't get that. Did you try again?
So my watch started talking. How weird was that? I think that most students of the Bible recognize Corinthians as having some tough places.
It's one of the most, at least I think for a lot of us, one of the most significant of Paul's letters. It's large and there's a lot in there, and a lot of it really matters to how we do church.
Yeah, and I think that we used to tell our interns that it may be the one book of the New Testament most likely to get you into trouble. So.
Oh yeah, I mean there's some challenging texts in there, and I for years have taught the book as Paul's letter about how to get church wrong. Just because of if you can mess it up in the assembly or the church somehow, the Corinthians found a way. Just about everything you can imagine, from messing up the Lord's Supper to just fighting with each other constantly. They made a mess of it.
Well, so let's work a little background on the Corinthian letter, starting with the gospel coming to the city of Corinth. So actually, the curious thing about that is it's not going to be unrelated
the Thessalonians
to our last letter.
That's right.
Exactly right.
That's right.
First Thessalonians. So let's throw the map back up that we used with the Thessalonian letters.
Yeah.
Paul would have made his way to Corinth during his second journey. And if you look at the map, not long after he was in Thessalonica,
he goes up in the north there.
He goes into Berea, and then he's making his way on down that peninsula. And Athens is where he sends Timothy back to check on the Thessalonians,
from Athens,
while he moves on to Corinth to begin the work of the gospel there.
Right. And all this is in Acts chapter 18 as far as reading.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the gospel coming to the city of Corinth.
Yeah, so Paul actually, from Philippi to Thessalonica down the peninsula to Corinth, Paul will actually spend, as far as really we can tell, the most time on the second missionary journey in Corinth of all these cities. Not that it's peaceful. You read Acts chapter 18, there's again accusations like there have been elsewhere, especially in Thessalonica, but it's not enough to drive Paul out, even though there are accusations made even to the city rulers, Gallio in particular.
By the way, which gives you some context to Thessalonica, how bad must it have been that he did have to leave?
Yeah, that's right. And Paul survives that controversy, and so he's able to work there for a total of about 18 months. And so it's entirely plausible that, as you mentioned, the Thessalonian letters mention Paul sending Timothy back when he's in Athens, but Paul moves on to Corinth. It's entirely possible, can't prove it, but that the Thessalonian letters are being written from Corinth. It's certainly plausible in terms of the time frame we're working with here. So again, that overlap we're talking about. Paul is working in Corinth while he's writing back up the Thessalonian.
Yeah, bearing in mind that we talked about Thessalonians, Paul is sending Timothy back from Athens to check on them. So he's got to go back and check and then come back and catch up with Paul, likely because of the amount of time he's in Corinth while he is there. And then, of course, he immediately sends the first letter to celebrate their return. So the likelihood it's written in Corinth, I think, is pretty strong.
Yeah, there's certainly good plausibility there. And then really this is kind of the end of the second journey. He when his time is up in Corinth, he goes across to Ephesus and then basically heads back to Caesarea, and that's the end of the second journey. He'll go back to Antioch for a little bit, and then the third journey starts. So that's the background to the church. Background to the letter. The letter is written during the third journey, a couple years later. a couple years later. And the first thing to recognize, and you'll notice this in your reading this week, is when you get to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it turns out that what we call 1 Corinthians is not Paul's first letter to that church.
By the way, as a pause on that real quick, I think sometimes we forget that that not all of the correspondence has been preserved, number one. And not all correspondence was necessarily inspired correspondence.
Right.
There may well have been information exchanged through letters. Yeah. That was just information exchanged.
Not to be preserved.
Or even necessarily inspired by the Spirit. Yeah. Surely there were letters written that were just like letters you and I might write, or in our case, email or text messages. Right. But there were other writings that were out there. Right. That would have been different from these that have been preserved.
Correct. And this is a perfect example of one of those moments. In chapter 5, verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter, in other words, in my previous letter, about not keeping company with the sexually immoral. And so then he'll go on to explain that teaching again in this letter, which, by the way, since it's explained and even clarified in this letter, may be part of the reason also why the first letter was not deemed necessary to be preserved, because all of its teaching is found in this letter, or clarified even, because part of what seems to be clear as you read chapter 5 on, they misunderstood Paul's first letter about this issue. Right. And so that's part of why the way Paul writes it this time is to clarify that. So you have, that's the true 1 Corinthians, if you will. So what we call 1 Corinthians is at least his second letter that we know of. So
by the way, as an aside real quick, imagine how frustrating this must have been, because you and I, we can literally text each other in the moment. Yeah. And when things are misunderstood, correct that. This, at best, is a process that's going to take months and months and more likely years as these letters slowly go.
You're talking about literally by ship you have to go, or, because you're going from Ephesus to Corinth and back and forth. So this is, this isn't just snail mail, man. This is sail mail. I mean, it's like literally slowly, boating back and forth these letters.
That was fresh. I like that.
You like that? Yeah, I try.
Let's talk a little bit about the circumstances, what gives rise to the writing, or what it is that he's trying to deal with when he sends this letter.
So I think we can narrow that down to three things. The letter itself gives us the evidence of three things.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's pretty clear about what his agenda is.
Yeah. The first thing the letter tells us about why this letter exists is actually in chapter 1, where in verse 11, he says, "For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there was Chloe's people are talking that there was quarreling among you, my brothers." So first reason he's writing this letter is people from Corinth have come to him and said, "There's problems, Paul."
Right.
So he's got that. That's reason number one, and that's actually where again this issue of divisions or quarreling, which is one of the things we remember the letter the most for, because those early chapters are all about dealing with this issue. That's right. Yep. So first reason, I've heard reports from members there that things aren't well. Second reason is implied in chapter 5, which we already looked at that first letter he sent. And maybe Chloe's people also mentioned this to him. We didn't say how he knows, but apparently he's aware that letter and how they handle church discipline has been misunderstood. So second reason is that. Third reason is chapter 7, verse 1. Third reason he writes this letter is chapter 7, verse 1, when he says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." Apparently, the congregation there has sent him a letter asking him some questions. They they have some things that they recognize they're concerned about, confused about, don't understand. And so they have actually sent Paul a list of questions, just like we ask people to email us questions about the books, for third week every month.
Week, yep.
Same thing here. They have sent Paul a list of questions, and so a big chunk of the second half of the book is really Paul going through their list of questions and answering them.
So walk through those again. There are three reasons you see.
Three reasons.
The report from Chloe's people. Yep. That's the first thing.
Yeah, people, I've heard from members of the congregation there's problems.
And second?
You've misunderstood my last letter.
You misunderstood chapter 5. You misunderstood us. And then third?
You've asked some questions. Here are my answers.
You've got some questions. Okay. Yeah. So that actually, I think, becomes a good framework for this first week.
It's really the structure of the book.
Yeah. And it's a good way to read the first week. And so let me encourage you again. You've heard us say this every single month. Sit down with Corinthians. It's longer.
16 chapters now.
But read all the way through and look for these three things that Paul is trying to do. Watch for that as you make your way through, and read it all the way through in one sitting so you get that sense that it's a letter. It really does read differently when you just read it all the way through and forget about the chapter and verse divisions. Right?
Yep.
So there we go for this week. Just get a feel for what the letter's about. And then next week, we're going to dig into what's the big idea, what's going on in the letter.